Okay. By way of introduction, I want to talk about a piece of music that I was listening to recently, and it was composed in 1972 by the Finnish composer Rautavaara, and it's called the Countess Arcticus Concerto for Birds and Orchestra, in which he uses recordings of the whooper swan throughout the piece, and one recording of a shore lark. I'm interested in this recording of the whooper swan because I am asking the question, what are animal acoustics and our animal voices doing in human arts and performance practices? And I'm especially interested in how birds and their vocal communication behavior with each other have been continuously connected to human acoustic technologies of recording and rendering. So while I was downloading this Concerto for Birds on iTunes, I watched some videos of whooper swans arriving in Finland, and there was more arriving in Japan and in Canada, and in no time at all I was drawn into the world of the snow goose via a website called performancecalls.com. And this website promised multiple methods of making you a better caller, unquote. The website was clearly interested in helping me to become a better hunter, not a better performance artist. And here I could purchase any number of calling devices and CDs that would make me sound like a snow goose in all sorts of weathers and conditions and ages. And the one that interests me the most was the snow screamer, which is a plastic horn that, quote, will have you barking, crying and hiccuping like an old snow goose at a realism level that is nothing short of extreme. So the snow screamer certainly offered possibilities to me as an artist interested in animal voices and easily excited by new technologies. But I couldn't wait for this snow screamer to come from Canada. So instead, and I really wanted to hear really what does a whooper swan really sound like. So I went to the sound effects website, where for €6 I can buy one of 61 different recordings that were made in 1989 by the BBC in a lake in Scotland, all of the whooper swan. I chose number 25068, and for this I get 8 minutes of my swan in the salt marsh in Scotland. But my swan only bears a passing resemblance to the carefully edited swans in Rautavaara's Concerto, his dreamlike and elegiac orchestrations. But his is a work of art, of course, with no obligation to realism or anything. But nowhere in the concerto is the swan's call translated into music per se. The sound of the swan is there beside the violins and the oboes, sounding quite like a swan. But it is nothing like my Scottish swan, who is snorting and cooing and barking and sloshing around in the freezing water. The atmosphere in my 8 minutes is evocative of the physical reality of this large bird, of its own avian drama and experience of what it might sound like for a swan to be a swan. For Rautavaara, the bird is always a metaphor or a meta-swan. So a recording of a bird in a performance context does not necessarily move a work of art any closer to understanding or illuminating the experience of listening to a bird, or for that matter, what it might be like for a bird to listen to another bird. But the history of humans listening to animals runs parallel with the history of musical technologies. Even before we enter the analog and digital ages, birdsong and human recording translating devices, some would say, stretch as far as Neanderthal or Stone Age times with bone flutes and so on. Right up to Jonathan Harvey's, the slide is here, there's my whooper swan details. And this is a slide of the technology that's involved in the performance of Jonathan Harvey's very celebrated piece, Bird Concerto for Piano Song, from 2001, where the recordings of Californian songbirds are digitally manipulated by the performer, by the pianist, through all of this machinery. But in the end, they still sound like recordings of birds. So they're attached to the work. They're not, for me, they're not, they're like ornamentally attached, like a brooch, to the artist's work. But useful. Birdsong is uniquely useful across many performing media, in theatre, radio plays, art installations, because it is immediately familiar and suggests another kind of air to the one that is in the theatre, or the concert hall, or the cinema. It's the air of the forest, the air of the dawn, or the ocean, or the meadow, and so on. So using birdsong in this way is uniquely ventriloquistic. It's a sort of ventriloquism, a dislocated performative sound from an invisible source. Birds' songs, noises, signals are uniquely ventriloquistic in this way because they're unfixed and they're indeterminate. An indeterminate sound traditionally has been a very valuable tool in performance practices. A voice without a visible source is often a voice of powers above and beyond the visible. Loaded with archaic references very often. The clap of thunder, the howling wind, the voice of God, the owl in the night, and the cuckoo in the morning. I was at a play in London recently, Jerusalem, which I'm sure many of you have seen, but I noticed not only were there live chickens on stage at the beginning of the play, but at every single scene change, when it went dark, it went bright again with the sounds of birds, and birds at different stages of the day, or at night, actually. So they were all over this play. Positioning animal sounds alongside the major acoustics of the stage and screen raises the question for me of the possibility of these sounds containing meaning that is going beyond metaphor. Why is it that we as humans have always been listening to the sounds of other species that are not intended for our understanding? And we have found multiple methods of incorporating the animal vocality into our sonic creations. For Akira Mizuta Lippitt, who Jonathan mentioned yesterday in his book, Lippitt's book Electric Animal, the animal presence in creative industries such as film is an amplification of historical anthropocentric stances in which the animal is an essential agent, and central to this process, Lippitt says, is animal vocality. He writes that only human beings are capable of speech, which in turn founds the human subject, and that animals enter this tautology as a phantasmatic counterpoint to human language, unquote. So the counterpoint to human language is animal acoustics, and it's an essential constitutional structural element of human language. In order to define human language, we need to point to the species that is speechless, and so on. This, of course, extends across philosophy, psychoanalysis, and literature, where the animal is always a metaphor, or what Lippitt calls the animetaphor. For example, the seagull in the play The Seagull, is never a seagull. It is always an animetaphor, or a meta-gull. In the realm of art, the artists that are engaging with animals in arts and performance contexts, the ones that interest me are the ones who move from metaphor or animetaphor and into metamorphosis. Beginning in modernism, with writers like Kafka as a major example, I look to artists in all media, who spend time picking away at established animal metaphors in order to activate a kind of change that addresses the modes and histories of human exceptionalism, and begin to turn towards and include the animal other as a means of expressiveness, or as an alternative or more inclusive way of being expressive. Donna Haraway is very direct in her book When Species Meet, when she advocates that divisions, quote, based on who can and cannot speak are antiquated. People, she says, quote, can stop looking for some single defining difference between them and everybody else based on language ability, and understand that they are in a rich, largely uncharted, face-to-face, flesh-to-flesh, richly material semiotic connection with a host of significant others. And one artist, I think, who recognizes this merging of worlds and of species is Marcus Coates, who we saw this film yesterday evening, and Giovanni referred to him this morning. From the beginning, he has been working with animal metaphors and metamorphosis. In this piece, he approximates the visuals and vocals of the blue-footed booby, which is the an endangered bird, to make a documentary on the humans that live on the Galapagos Islands. In this piece, which I'll talk more about, it's a short film, one of his earliest works from 2003 called Finfolk. And in the film, he emerges from the water in a tracksuit, and he stands and starts speaking, mumbling, and then speaking this nonsense sort of language, which is a mixture of Scottish, Gaelic, and English. And he's drawing on the Scottish and Irish myths of selkies or seal people that live this double life in and out of the water. So he invents this language which sounds kind of like fin, fu, fu, fuck, 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 fuck. And then he gets back in the water because people arrive, and the camera pulls out and you see an actual seal bobbing out on the ocean. So by flattening these languages and folk tales into one, and mixing in some grunting and spitting, Coates is not imitating a seal, or indeed a person, but he's opening the doors between species where some traits, including vocality, spill and mix into each other, creating a logic of nonsense, and one that pierces concepts of both human and animal, of what it's like to be a seal person. He does this as authentically as possible, however absurd it makes him look, or however absurd it makes us look. This is the dawn chorus again, which we refer to and Giovanni described. I won't describe it anymore. What I will say is the fact that each person is isolated in their own habitat is quite poignant. It's quite moving, I think. And again, the singers are not imitating birds, but they are interpreting. They are singers themselves, and they're interpreting a core selection of noises and vocalizations, which they then develop themselves over the course of the filming. Birdsong has always been symbolic, generalized and fetishized, with only remote allegiances to its sonic origins, and more importantly, its vocalized intentions, if there is an openness to the idea that animal sounds have intentionality or can be influential. If an artist employs animal sounds in manifestations of their ideas, even if these ideas are connected to an analysis of animals or human and animal relationships and comparisons, it is with interpretations and transformations, more importantly, of the material, like birdsong. It's this transformational activity, by whatever means, is the method to get us over and back across the gaps between species. So in conclusion, I would say that the history of listening to animals, as in ornithology, and of interpreting animal voices in music and song, runs parallel with the history of musical technologies. In his study of the phenomenon of sound, called Listening and Voice, Don Ida calls this trajectory a phenomenology of instrumentation, where through millennia the body holds its moment in time through listening and playing music by whatever means. Ida suggests that when we explore the possibility of animal communication through the lens of phenomenology, we are leaving the sense of metaphor and entering the neighborhood of voice at its center, unquote. The history of musical instrumentation, musical instrumental innovation, is also the history of recording technology and runs parallel with the history of listening and responding to other species in our sonic environment. None of these histories is fixed, all is changing and continue to change. And in the words of Alfonso Lingus, we are always listening to the murmur of the world. Thank you.